May 22nd, 1946. The courtyard of Pankrác Prison, Prague. It is a bright, sunny morning. 5,000 people are packed into the space, shoulder to shoulder, many of them admitted by special invitation cards issued by the Czechoslovak government. In the front rows, sitting still and silent, are women, widows, women who survived Ravensbrück concentration camp, women who came home to find their husbands shot, their children gone, their villages erased from the earth. Behind them, ordinary Czech citizens who waited years for this moment. Some fathers have lifted their children onto their shoulders so they can see clearly over the crowd. In the center of the courtyard stands a wooden gallows, not the kind you have seen in old Western films. Something older, something more deliberate. A pole rising from a platform with a rope hanging from it. 3 executioners in white gloves stand waiting, their faces calm, their job already planned out in every detail. Then a door opens. A man walks out, between 2 guards. He is 48 years old. He is wearing a ragged Nazi SS uniform, the only thing left of the empire he helped build. He walks quietly. His face is blank, expressionless, catatonic, like a man who has already disconnected from the body doing the walking. An official reads the sentence aloud one final time. The crowd listens in silence. The man does not react. He is led to the base of the gallows steps. He climbs. He stands on the platform. A rope is placed around his neck. And then, in front of 5,000 witnesses, including the widows of the men he murdered, Karl Hermann mutters his last words. Deutschland wird leben auch wenn wir nicht leben. Germany will live, even if we do not live. 4 seconds later, the executioner hoisted him upward. Not dropped. Raised, in the Austro-Hungarian pole-hanging method, the condemned is lifted from the ground. Suspended by the rope, while the executioner reaches in and physically breaks the neck with his hands. It is not clean. It is not quick. It is not designed to be. The crowd watched in silence. Then, as Frank's body went still, the silence broke. Thousands of Czech men and women, many of whom had lost family to this man's orders, began to cheer. And now I am going to tell you exactly what Karl Hermann did to deserve that moment. I am going to tell you about the villages he erased, the children he murdered, the thousands of people he had executed, and the extraordinary chain of events that led him from a one-eyed bookseller's son in a small Bohemian spa town, all the way to the end of a rope in Prague. I'm warning you now. This story contains the deliberate mass murder of children, the complete destruction of innocent communities, and one of the most methodical campaigns of state terrorism in modern European history. If you believe that the perpetrators of atrocities like this need to be named, remembered, and never allowed to hide behind the comfortable fog of history, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell, because that is exactly what this channel is here to do. We don't sanitize, we don't look away, we tell it straight. This is the story of Karl Hermann. January 24th, 1898, Carlsbad, Bohemia. At the time this city was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today it is called Karlovy Vary and sits in the Czech Republic. Frank was born into a German-speaking family in what was then one of the most fashionable spa towns in Europe. A city of thermal baths, grand hotels, and European aristocracy coming to take the waters. His father was a bookseller with strong nationalist opinions, a follower of Georg Ritter von Schneider, an Austrian politician who preached aggressive pan-Germanic ideology and intense anti-Semitism. From the time he could understand words, Karl Hermann was being taught that Germans were superior, that Slavic people were lesser, and that the mixing of German blood with other races was a catastrophe to be prevented at any cost. His father didn't just hold these views quietly, he taught them, argued them, lived them, and Karl Hermann absorbed every word. When World War I broke out in 1914, Frank was 16 years old. He watched young men march off to fight for the empire. When he was old enough, he tried to enlist. He was rejected. The reason was both banal and, given what came later, darkly ironic. He was blind in his right eye. The Austro-Hungarian army did not want him. So while the war raged around him, he spent a year studying law at the German language division of Charles University in Prague, working as a tutor to pay his bills. He was an unremarkable student. No great academic achievements, no notable friendships, just a young man from a nationalist household, nursing nationalist ideas, existing at the margins of a world he believed owed him more than it was giving him. The war ended in 1918. Germany and Austria-Hungary lost. The old empire collapsed entirely. And in the ruins of that empire, a new state was born. Czechoslovakia, formed under the Treaty of Versailles, this new nation brought together Czechs, Slovaks, and approximately 3 million ethnic Germans who lived in the border regions of Bohemia and Moravia, a strip of land that would come to be called the Sudetenland. Overnight, Karl Hermann went from being a citizen of the dominant empire to a minority in someone else's country. For a man already primed by his father's ideology to see the world as a struggle between German supremacy and Slavic encroachment, this was not just a political inconvenience. It was a wound that never healed. He spent the 1920s nursing that wound, working as a bookseller like his father, building connections in ethnic German nationalist circles, watching as Czechoslovakia became a functioning democracy and the Germans within it were asked to participate in it as equals. He didn't want equality. He wanted dominance. And he was patient. In the early 1930s, as Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany proper, a parallel movement was forming in the Sudetenland. In 1933, a gymnastics teacher and local political organizer named Konrad Henlein founded the Sudetendeutsche Heimatfront, the Sudeten German Homeland Front. It presented itself publicly as a moderate autonomy movement, loyal to Czechoslovakia, just seeking fair treatment for ethnic Germans. Behind the scenes, it was something else entirely. It was a machine built for radicalization, funded by Berlin, designed to destabilize Czechoslovakia from within. Frank joined it immediately, and in 1935, when it was renamed the Sudeten German Party, the SDP, Frank became deputy leader. His influence dragged the party rapidly to the right, where Henlein in his early speeches had carefully maintained the fiction of moderation. Frank didn't bother with the fiction. He was a true believer. He wanted annexation. He wanted the destruction of Czechoslovakia as an independent state. He wanted the Sudetenland absorbed into the Reich. In the 1935 Czechoslovak parliamentary elections, the SDP received over 1.2 million votes, making it the single largest party in the entire country, outpolling every Czech party as well. This was not an accident. It was the result of systematic radicalization carried out over years, with Frank at the center of it. Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, later described Frank as a Jew hater of the Streicher kind, a reference to Julius Streicher, the virulently anti-Semitic Nazi propagandist. He said Frank carried out oppression with exceptional brutality. Coming from Eichmann, that is not a casual observation. That is a professional assessment. September 29, 1938, Munich, the prime ministers of Britain and France, Neville Chamberlain and Duard Daladier, sat down with Hitler and Mussolini and handed over the Sudetenland without Czechoslovakia even being invited to the table. Chamberlain flew home waving his piece of paper, talking about peace in our time. What he had actually done was hand 3 million people and their territory to a regime that would use them as a staging ground for total conquest. Karl Hermann had spent years helping build the pressure that produced that moment. Now, he watched it pay off. Within days, German troops marched into the Sudetenland, while Sudeten Germans lined the streets cheering, waving Nazi flags, throwing flowers. For Frank, this was vindication of everything he had worked for. But Hitler was not done. He never intended to stop at the Sudetenland. On March 15, 1939, German troops crossed into the remaining Czech territory. President Emil Hoxha of Czechoslovakia was dragged to Berlin in the middle of the night, his heart failing under the stress of the encounter, and forced to sign over what remained of his country. By morning, German tanks were rolling through Prague. Bohemia and Moravia were declared a protectorate of the German Reich. Slovakia was made a puppet state. Czechoslovakia, the most stable democracy in Central Europe, ceased to exist. Karl Hermann Frank was appointed State Secretary of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. He was now in command of the Nazi police apparatus throughout the occupied Czech lands, including the Gestapo, the SD, and the Kripo. He was, in practical terms, one of the two most powerful men in the country he had helped destroy. The nominal leader above him was Reich Protector Konstantin von Neurath, an older diplomat who was considered insufficiently harsh by the Nazi leadership. Frank disagreed with von Neurath constantly. He wanted harder repression. He wanted the Czechs terrorized into submission, not merely administered. He wanted the occupation to feel like what it was. And by the time Reinhard Heydrich arrived to replace von Neurath in late 1941, Karl Hermann Frank had already overseen the arrest of between 4,000 and 5,000 people, and the execution of between 400 and 500 of them. Those numbers come from Heydrich's own reporting. By February 1942, in less than 3 years of occupation, Frank had built a police state that murdered hundreds of Czech citizens and imprisoned thousands more. Then came May 27, 1942. At 10:30 in the morning, Reinhard Heydrich's green Mercedes convertible was making its daily run through the streets of Prague, carrying him from his villa at Pankrác Prison to his offices at Prague Castle. Heydrich was perhaps the most feared man in occupied Europe, commander of the Reich Security Main Office, principal architect of the final solution. A man so powerful and so widely hated that he was known simply as the Butcher of Prague. He was also fatally arrogant. He traveled in an open-topped car, on the same route, at roughly the same time every day, with minimal security. He believed no Czech would dare touch him. At a hairpin curve near the Belovka Hospital in Prague's Leib district, he was wrong. Two men were waiting at that curve: Josef Gapk, a Slovak soldier, and Jan Kuby, a Czech soldier. Both had been parachuted into occupied Czechoslovakia from Britain 5 months earlier as part of Operation Anthropoid, a joint mission between the British Special Operations Executive and the Czechoslovak government in exile. Their mission was to kill Heydrich. They had spent those 5 months hiding with resistance families in Prague, memorizing Heydrich's route, planning the ambush down to the last detail. As Heydrich's car slowed at the curve, Gapk stepped into the road and leveled his Sten submachine gun at the vehicle. The gun jammed. In the fraction of a second that followed, Heydrich made the decision that killed him. Instead of ordering his driver to accelerate through the kill zone, he stood up in the car and drew his Luger to shoot Gapk himself. That moment of arrogance gave Kuby the opening he needed. He threw a modified anti-tank grenade at the car. It struck the rear fender and detonated, sending shrapnel through the vehicle, through the seat, through Heydrich's body. Heydrich climbed out of the car, fired at the fleeing assassins, and then collapsed in the road. He was taken to hospital. For several days it seemed he might survive. Then sepsis set in. The shrapnel had carried seat fiber and horsehair into his body, and the wound became infected. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died of blood poisoning in a Prague hospital. He was 38 years old. The reaction from Nazi leadership was volcanic. Hitler, receiving the news in his headquarters, demanded the immediate murder of 10,000 Czech civilians as reprisal. He wanted mass executions right now, today, across the entire protectorate. And here is where Karl Hermann Frank did something that looks at first glance like an act of restraint, but was in fact something far colder. He flew to Berlin. He sat across from Adolf Hitler. And he talked him out of it. Not because he wanted mercy for the Czechs. He wanted no such thing. He talked Hitler out of 10,000 immediate executions because he knew that destroying the Czech workforce that badly would damage the German war economy. The Protectorate was an industrial zone of enormous value to the Reich. Czech factories were producing weapons, machinery, vehicles. Killing 10,000 workers in a blind rage was bad economics. Frank argued for something more surgical. something that would terrorize the population into submission without destroying the productive base. Hitler listened. He reduced the number. He focused the reprisal on specific targets. And Karl Hermann Frank went home and chose the targets. On the evening of June 9, 1942, the night of Heydrich's state funeral in Berlin, SS and police units surrounded the village of Lidice, a small farming and coal mining settlement of about 500 people located 12 miles northwest of Prague. The connection to the assassination was essentially non-existent. The Gestapo had intercepted a love letter from a man named Václav H., who, trying to end an affair, had written vaguely that he had done what he had wanted to do and implied some connection to the assassination. He had nothing to do with it. But the interrogation of his lover led the Gestapo to a family named Hawk in Lidice, because a son of that family had left to join the Czech Air Force in Britain. That was the justification. A family in the village had a son who was in the same general army as the men who killed Heydrich. That was enough. Frank had ordered Horst Biemer, the SS police chief in Prague, to shoot all the men, send all the women to concentration camps, and take the children. Those few children considered suitable for Germanization were to be handed to SS families in Germany. The rest of the children were to be murdered, shortly before dawn on June 10, 1942. The men and boys of Lidice, aged 15 and older, were marched to the farm of the Hawk family on the edge of the village. They were lined up against the barn wall in groups. Firing squads shot them. One group, then the next, then the next. It took hours. 173 men and boys died against that wall. Another 11 who had not been in the village that day were hunted down and executed soon after. 4 pregnant women were taken to the hospital where Heydrich had died and forced to undergo abortions. Then they were sent to concentration camps. The women of Lidice, 184 of them, were loaded onto trucks, taken to Kladno, and put on a train to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Their children had already been separated from them. The children were taken to D in Poland. 81 of those children were later loaded into gas vans at the Chemno extermination camp and murdered. 9 were considered racially suitable for Germanization and given to SS families, who changed their names and told them they were German. The village of Lidice itself was burned to the ground, the ruins demolished with explosives, the cemetery dug up, the very earth bulldozed flat. By the time the Germans were done, there was no village. There was nothing, not a wall, not a foundation, not a headstone. The name Lidice was to be erased from every map, every record, every memory, as if it had never existed. 14 days later, on June 24, 1942, Frank's police apparatus repeated the operation at Leckie, a tiny settlement of about 50 people east of Prague. The Gestapo had found a radio transmitter there belonging to another British-trained resistance group. Every adult in Leckie, both men and women, was shot. Their children were sent to D. 2 girls were selected for Germanization. The rest of the children were killed. The village was leveled. It has never been rebuilt. Today the site is an empty field with memorial markers where houses once stood. Across the Protectorate in the weeks following Heydrich's assassination, Frank's apparatus arrested 3,188 Czech citizens. Of those, 1,327 were sentenced to death. Thousands of Jews from Prague were deported to Majdanek and other extermination camps. The total death toll from the reprisals has been estimated at 5,000 people. 5,000 human beings killed because 2 soldiers threw a grenade at one man's car, and Frank was the machine that processed that killing. He signed the death sentences. He directed the police operations. He built the bureaucratic infrastructure of murder and ran it with the efficiency of a man who genuinely believed in what he was doing. In August 1943, Frank was elevated further, made Minister of State for Bohemia and Moravia, a cabinet-level position in the Nazi hierarchy. He was now officially one of the most powerful figures in the occupied Czech lands. In 1944, as the war began to turn decisively against Germany, he personally directed anti-partisan operations in Moravia against a resistance group called the Jan Ika Partisan Brigade. He deployed 13,000 soldiers. He ordered the summary execution of civilians merely suspected of supporting the partisans. Despite that overwhelming force and that willingness to kill innocent people, his forces failed to destroy the brigade. They falsely reported that the threat had been eliminated and moved on. The partisans were still there. The dead civilians were still dead. April 30th, 1945, Prague, the Third Reich, was collapsing in real time. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler would be dead within hours. Allied forces were converging from every direction. And in Prague, something extraordinary was happening. The Czech people were rising up. After 6 years of occupation, 6 years of terror, 6 years of watching their countrymen shot and their villages burned, the citizens of Prague had taken to the streets, attacking German military positions, tearing down German signs, raising the Czech flag over buildings. It was the Prague uprising, and it was happening city by city, block by block, with ordinary people fighting with rifles and pistols and bare hands. Karl Hermann went on the radio. He announced to the people of Prague, live over the airwaves, that he would drown any rebellion in a sea of blood. Those were his exact words. Drown it in a sea of blood. It was a statement that revealed everything about who he was. Not a pragmatist who had made hard choices in wartime, not a soldier following orders under impossible circumstances. A man who, with his empire crumbling around him, with the war already lost, with history already recording his crimes, chose to threaten genocide as his final public act. The sea of blood did not come. German forces in Prague were overwhelmed. The SS troops he commanded either fled or surrendered. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. On May 9, 1945, Karl Hermann was arrested by soldiers of the United States Army in the area of Rokycany in western Bohemia. He was 47 years old. He had a ragged SS uniform. He had no power. He had no army. He had nothing left but the record of what he had done. He was transferred to Czechoslovak custody and taken to Prague. The trial began on March 22, 1946, before the Czechoslovak Extraordinary People's Court in Prague. It was one of the earliest post-war trials of a senior Nazi official, running concurrently with the Nuremberg proceedings. And it was conducted with a seriousness that the Nuremberg trials would have recognized. Prosecutors assembled documentary evidence on a scale that left almost no room for denial. Camp records, execution orders, photographs of the ruins of Lidice, photographs of the bodies, German propaganda film that the Nazis themselves had made of the Lidice operation, intending it as a boast, now submitted as evidence of crimes against humanity. Then the survivors took the stand. Women from Lidice sat in the witness box and described what had happened to them. They described being separated from their husbands and not being told their husbands had already been shot. They described the train to Ravensbrück. They described the forced labor, the beatings, the starvation. They described coming home after the war and finding nothing. Not a building, not a grave, just flat earth where a village used to be, and a list of names of people who would never come back. One witness described how she had searched for her children for 2 years after the war. How she had found one of them, renamed, speaking German, not recognizing her own mother. How the child had been told that Czech people were subhuman. How it took years to undo what had been done to that child's mind. Frank sat in the courtroom with headphones on, listening to the translation. Newsreel footage shows him in those sessions, lips pursed, eyes down, occasionally chewing on a finger. Witnesses recalled seeing him in 1942. They pointed at him across the courtroom. He was there, he had signed the papers, he had given the orders. In his defense, Frank argued that he had acted in the interest of the Germans, that he had been a loyal officer of the Reich, doing what his position required, that the orders for Lidice had come from Hitler himself, that he had in fact moderated Hitler's initial demand for 10,000 executions. He presented himself as a reluctant instrument of a chain of command that bore the real responsibility. This was a defense that prosecutors dismantled methodically and without mercy. Yes, the initial order came from Hitler. And then Frank had taken that order, refined it, given it specific targets, built the operational machinery, signed the death lists, and supervised the executions. The Nuremberg precedent had already established that following orders is not a defense for war crimes. You have a moral obligation to refuse criminal orders. Frank had not refused. He had applied himself to them with professional enthusiasm, escalating when he could, advocating for harshness, choosing the villages, selecting the methods. The witnesses from Lidice did not let the courtroom forget what those methods meant in human terms. These were not abstractions. These were real women sitting in a real room, describing the day their families were destroyed, while the man responsible sat 10 meters away listening through headphones. On May 22, 1946, Karl Hermann Frank was found guilty of crimes against humanity. The sentence was death. And here, if you believe in justice, if you believe that power without accountability is the most dangerous thing on earth, if you believe that history is not just something that happened to other people, but a warning that demands to be heard, then what happened next in the courtyard of Pankrác Prison mattered. It still matters. Subscribe, because the stories we're telling on this channel are the ones that prove why it matters. The morning of May 22nd was bright and clear. The 5,000 people admitted to the courtyard had been carefully organized. The second row of seats was reserved for the women of Lidice who had survived Ravensbrück and come home to nothing. They sat there in the sunlight, not speaking, watching the door through which Frank would walk. There was not the slightest gleam of compassion in that long row of eyes. The gallows had been constructed in the center of the courtyard. Not the standard drop gallows used in British or American executions, where a trapdoor opens under the condemned, and the drop is calculated to break the neck in a fraction of a second. This was the Austro-Hungarian pole-hanging method, a vertical pole with a rope attached at the top. The condemned would be placed beneath the rope, lifted from the ground, and the neck broken by the executioner's hands. It was slow enough to be witnessed. It was brutal enough to register as something other than a bureaucratic procedure. It was, in its own terrible way, suited to the crime. Karl Hermann Frank was brought out between two guards at 10 o'clock in the morning. He walked quietly, his face expressionless, wearing his ragged SS uniform, the only clothes he had. An official read the sentence aloud in front of the crowd. Frank did not react. He was led to the gallows steps. He climbed. 3 executioners in white gloves were on the platform waiting. The rope was placed around his neck. Then he spoke. Deutschland wird leben auch wenn wir nicht leben. Germany will live even if we do not live. He said it quietly, not defiant, not heroic, more like a man reciting something he had memorized long ago, something he needed to say to make the moment feel like what he wanted it to be. A sacrifice for something larger than himself. A death with meaning. The executioners lifted him. The rope went taut. The executioner's hands moved. The neck broke. The crowd watched in silence until it was over. Then the cheering began. Newsreel cameras captured everything. Film director G. Weiss, who watched the footage later in London, described what he saw. He said it looked medieval. He said he saw fathers in the crowd lifting their children onto their shoulders so they could see the hanging better. He said that in close-up, when the executioner broke Frank's neck, he felt physically ill and lost consciousness. The audience, he noted, liked it very much. It was a different experience for people who had lived through the occupation, who had lost people, who had spent 6 years afraid, than it was for someone watching from the outside. For those people in that courtyard, it was not entertainment, and it was not revenge. It was confirmation that the world had a mechanism for accountability. That men who murdered villages could be made to stand in front of the people they had harmed and answer for it. The body of Karl Hermann Frank was examined by a forensic doctor named Navarra to confirm death. By a strange coincidence that history seems to have arranged deliberately, Dr. Navarra's wife was a nurse who had given first aid to Reinhard Heydrich after the ambush in May 1942. The same hands that had once tried to save the man who started this chain of events confirmed the death of the man who carried it out. Frank was buried in an unmarked grave at the Blythe Cemetery in Prague. No marker, no headstone, no place for anyone to come and grieve or commemorate, just a hole in the ground for a man who had tried to put entire villages into holes in the ground. It was the last public execution in the history of Prague. And now I want you to sit with something, because this is the part that has followed me since I first read through the full record of what happened in Bohemia and Moravia between 1939 and 1945. Karl Hermann Frank was not a secret criminal. He was not hiding his crimes in the dark. The Nazis filmed the destruction of Lidice. They photographed it. They announced it on the radio the very next day. The announcement said, with no apology, no euphemism, all male inhabitants have been shot, the women have been transferred to a concentration camp, the children have been taken to educational centers, all houses of Lidice have been leveled to the ground, and the name of this community has been obliterated. The word obliterated. They chose that word deliberately. They were proud of it. They wanted the world to know. They wanted every Czech person listening to understand what resistance would cost. Frank signed off on that announcement. He wanted it broadcast. He wanted the fear. What he did not want, what he apparently could not imagine even as the Allied armies closed in from every direction in the spring of 1945, was that the world would remember Lidice not as a warning to Czech resistors, but as an indictment of him personally. That the filmed evidence the Nazis made of their own atrocity would become the footage played at his trial. That the women he had sent to Ravensbrück would come home. That they would sit in the second row of seats at Pankrác Prison and watch him die. He could not imagine that, because men like Frank always believe that the power they hold is permanent, that the machinery they control will always protect them. That history bends toward the strong. It does not. 173 men and boys were shot against a barn wall in Lidice. Their names are recorded. The village has been rebuilt 300 meters from where it was destroyed, and a memorial stands on the site of the original houses. A rose garden with 82 bronze statues of children stands there now, one for each child who did not come home. 82 bronze children, frozen at the ages they were in 1942, standing in the place where the Nazis tried to make sure no one would ever remember they existed. You can go there today. You can walk among those statues. You can read the names. Karl Hermann Frank wanted those names gone. He failed. The village of Lecky was never rebuilt. The field where it stood is still empty, marked by small stones where the houses were. The names of the people who lived there are on those stones. The two little girls who survived the war, selected for Germanization, who had German names and German families by the time liberation came, eventually found their way home. They remembered. You do not forget a thing like that. Frank's last words, "Germany will live even if we do not live," were the words of a man who had spent his entire adult life subordinating individual human beings to an abstraction called Germany, a Germany of his imagining, a Germany of racial purity and historical destiny and ethnic domination. For that abstraction, he had condemned villages to death. For that abstraction, he had sent 173 men to a farm wall and shot them. For that abstraction, he had separated mothers from children, sent those children to gas vans in Poland, and told the ones left alive that they were German now, and their real families were dead. His Germany did not live. It collapsed in rubble and shame. The protectorate he helped construct lasted 6 years. The memorial at Lidice has lasted 80. Justice, when it comes, does not always come quickly. It does not always come completely. Most of the men who ran the Gestapo apparatus under Frank were never tried. Most of the officers who supervised the executions at Lidice and Lecky died in their beds. The machinery of evil requires thousands of hands, and history only ever catches a fraction of them. Frank was caught. He was tried in front of survivors. He was executed in front of 5,000 witnesses. He was buried in a hole with no name on it. That is not nothing. That is in fact everything that accountability looks like when institutions do their job. A court, witnesses, evidence, a verdict, a consequence. The women from Lidice sat in the second row and watched it happen. The executioner's white gloves were placed on the wooden steps of the gallows when it was over. The crowd turned to leave the courtyard. The bright May sun was still shining. If you believe that stories like this one need to be told in full, without softening the details, without letting perpetrators hide behind the rank of their superiors or the complexity of their era, then this channel exists for you. The 173 men of Lidice deserve to be named. The 82 children standing in bronze in that rose garden deserve to be counted. Karl Hermann deserves to be exactly what he was. Not a wartime administrator, not a man of his times. A murderer who erased 2 villages, oversaw the deaths of more than 1,000 Czech citizens, and tried to make the world forget that any of it happened. He failed. We remember. Subscribe, leave a comment, tell us which story we should tell next, because the people who have been waiting a long time to be remembered are still waiting, and this is the work.